One of the most challenging parts to any woodworking project is making the doors. I can remember when I was younger thinking if I could just learn how to make raised panel doors, that'd be incredible. Pretty quick after that, I realized I was going to have to buy a bunch of special equipment and special cutters. One of the things I love about the way that I make a lot of doors now is it doesn't take any special equipment really. All I need is a miter saw, a router, and a Craig jig. And I can put together all kinds of great looking doors. Another thing that excites me about this is I can really vary the doors by just using different moldings and different styles and even a different router bit to go around the outside edge. Again, it's still just tools that I've already got. Now here's an example of a door that we've made. This is actually a mitered corner door. I wouldn't have to miter the corners to make this door, but it's really an upgraded look. What we've done is we've made a frame, then we've dropped a plywood panel in it and run a molding around it. There's lots of different moldings that I could use to give different looks, and it really gives a great custom effect. A bonus is, because this is a plywood panel, it's more stable than a raised panel, and it's also a lot quicker to cut a plywood panel than it is to glue up a raised panel. So let's take a look at just what we have to do to make this great looking door. Okay, here's the secret to building these great looking mitered corner doors. It's these micro pocket holes. I can get 2 screws in this joint really close together, and those screws are going to pull that joint together. I'm going to put a little bit of glue in it and I'll have a really strong joint. Now another thing that's really important, and I've said this before and I'm going to say it again, you've got to have a really good setup on your miter saw with a very accurate stop, because these need to be cut on true 45s and they need to be exactly the same length. So you're going to want a good blade, a good saw, and then you've got to have a stop system that you can count on to cut them to length. But another thing that's really helps with that is once you've got a great stop system, you don't have to be pulling out a tape measure and measuring all the time. You just slide it over the stop and you're going to get great cuts. Also, it's important to make sure that you don't have sawdust laying around on your fence, because just a little bit of sawdust between the fence and the edge of your molding can ruin the cut. Take your time, get great cuts, and you'll have a great looking door. For the style of door that I'm building, it's really important to make sure that I keep this rabbet turned away from me when I put my piece of trim down into the jig. And I'm going to be using these 2 holes that are closest together. And what I do is just slide over. Once I can't see any more of that hole, I know that it's right where I want to be. And I like to go ahead and put all of my micro holes in the top pieces, the top rail of the door, so to speak. It just gives it a nice uniform look. Okay, again, you got to keep focused on keeping that rabbet turned away from me. I have actually seen people make doors sometimes where they would put those holes where they could be seen and put like a contrasting plug in there. It just depends on how artsy you are, I guess. But for us, we're going to use some cherry plugs and minimize the appearance of those. Okay, now that we've got those holes drilled, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is screwing the joints together. And I'm going to use this clamping system to make sure that we keep the pieces really flat on the table while we screw them together. A couple other things to remember: just like any other method for building doors, you want to keep the bow in your material such that when you lay it against the face frame, it's going to make contact at the top and bottom. Now, this piece of material is really straight, but if it did have a hump in it, I'd want that hump to be up so that the top and bottom corners of the door would meet the frame. There's nothing worse than having a door that kind of hits in the middle and it's away from the cabinet frame at the top and bottom. So that's, again, just like building any door, but it's something you want to remember as you're milling up all of your material. Okay, Just match up those points. Now, I like to go ahead and do the two short ends first and then add the long piece last to complete the frame. And this is really still pretty forgiving. If you don't have an absolutely perfect joint, as long as everything's pushed down to the front, there's some tricks that I'll show you here in a little bit that make it to where even if it's not perfect when you start, it can look perfect when you finish. These are a 1-inch screw that I'm using. Okay. As you can see, I've got pretty tight joints. The material's not perfectly flat, and that's simply because we didn't get it all planed the same thickness like we might have. But if you flip over on this front, everything's pretty tight. And what we're going to do here real quick is I'm going to do just a little rough sanding on this side. I'm going to flip it over, plug the holes on the back with my micro cherry plugs. We're going to let that glue set for a little bit while we put together the next frame. So what I need to do on any of these, that if the joint is not just totally together, I'll just put a little bit of glue on them, like that. Wipe the excess off. Now I'm going to take my big sander and hit that real quick. Okay, now there you can see one after it's been filled and sanded. Now over here I've got just a little bit of opening. I'm going to rub a little bit of glue in that, and then we'll sand it and see how it looks. So as you can see, it's pretty forgiving. Now I'm going to work my way around the frame doing that, and I'll flip it over, plug the holes in the back, and while the glue is drying a little bit for the plugs, I'll put together the next door frame. Okay, I'm not really worried about having extra glue because I'm going to random orbit this whole thing a couple times. So that's pretty much what I want them to look like, is almost flush and glue all the way around them. It does take a little bit of experience. Once you've done a few, you'll get an idea of how much glue you need to put in there. If you get too much glue in there, it can make it hard to get the plug down in there. But just a good big drop like that. Now I'll just come back and put a little more around the outside. Okay, now let's go to the other end. I'll just flip this thing around. Now once we get these in here, we're probably going to need to wait about 15-20 minutes. So again, we'll just keep on working on another door. Okay, I'm going to set this one aside and then we'll do the next one. Okay, these plugs have had a chance to dry, so we're ready for the next step, which is going to be rough sanding the back of this. Again, I call it rough sanding because I'm probably using about an 80 grit sander and a pretty aggressive cut. We're going to come back and finish off, for me, with about 100 grit. Some people might go 120, even 150 or something. But for me, usually I can get close enough that I'm not bearing down too far with 100 grit. But for right now, we're still pretty rough. Now at this point, I'm going to kind of blow the loose sawdust out there and see if there's any place I need to put a little bit more glue in. Which is probably that long point of that miter. Put a little bit there too, maybe. As long as you sand that while the glue is still wet, it just fills in real nicely. I mean, there are some limitations. You can't fill an 1/8 inch gap that way, but those small gaps, they pretty much just disappear when you put a little bit of glue in them and sand them down. Let's flip this around and start on the other end. Now that I'm finished my rough sanding, I'm going to switch to some 100 grit paper on a smaller sander to final sand the face of this, which is really important to do that before I put any molding in there, because once the molding's in there, you're pretty much done. Okay, I'm just going to drop in my plywood panel. Now, this is a piece of 1/4 inch plywood. If I wanted a little bit sturdier, stiffer door, I could buy a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and just rebate around the edge to where I had a 1/4 inch edge to drop in. Now, for this mitered corner door, I put the rebate in long pieces and then cut them to length. It'd actually be almost impossible to cut that rebate in after I'd cut the pieces to length. But if I was going to use a butt joint like this, I have to wait until the frame is assembled and then rebate around the inside edge. And what I'm going to end up with then is a radius corner where the router bit goes into the corner. I have to stop and square that out, which is kind of a trade out. This joint goes together a little bit faster, maybe not quite as fussy, but then you have to square out the corners. Now, no matter which method that you use, you need to make certain that you place these pocket screws far enough back away from where you're going to be doing your rebating, and also away from the edge where you're going to run a router around the outside of the door for your final decorative edge, so that you don't run your router bit into the screws. Just one of those things that if you ever do it once, you'll remember it. All right, now I'm ready to fit the molding inside here. Now, as you can see, I've rebated the edge, and that is pretty critical because what we want to do is have it fit to where it pushes the plywood down tight but doesn't have a gap underneath here. Now, of course, realistically, nothing's perfect, but we want a pretty snug fit here with the plywood held down in place. And I'm going to work my way around pinning these trim pieces in place. I have done it in such a way that I took all the pieces and nailed them together first and then dropped that frame in there. And there are some advantages to that because there's places that I can put a nail or actually a headless pin to hold the joint together that I won't be able to do if I drop the pieces down. And you know, this is just kind of one of those things where try it both ways, see which one works best for you. But we're going to start out by just going ahead and nailing these pieces in place. Now, I pre-cut these pieces. Now, as best you can, it's probably wise to cut them a little bit long or tight because you can always shorten them a little bit, but it's really hard to grow them. Now, I'm not putting any glue in these joints for a couple reasons. It would really make things rough if we had a little bit of glue come out inside there. It's almost impossible to sand glue out of there. You just pretty much got to scrape it. And also because the pieces are pretty well locked in against the frame, the glue's not all that necessary. I've done it several different ways. Sometimes I'll put the little end pieces on first and fit the long ones. Sometimes I go all the way around. It's just something you have to figure out what works best for you. Now I'm going to real carefully try and shoot a headless pin back through there, and that can also kind of help lock that miter joint together. Okay. Now, a lot of times when you get down to the end, you need to make a little adjustment cut. And this isn't going to be absolutely perfect, but it's pretty close. What I think I'm going to do is take my block plane and just underbevel this a little bit. And that's so, if I underbevel it some, then all that's going to hit is the face, which is the only part you see anyway. Now you can also do this just by taking your utility knife, and you can cut back some like that. I like to do it with the block plane, but either way will work. And that did help that joint some. Go ahead and pin through like that. Pin through that joint. It's pretty hard to do the real fine work like this without a 23 gauge headless pinner, but you can do it with a brad nailer. And I think that door looks as good as any raised panel door you'd ever make. Now, the final step is going to be putting some sort of a routed edge around the outside. We're not trying to get too decorative for their edge. We're just going to put just a bare round over around this piece, and then we'll turn it over and drill for our European hinges. Okay, the last thing we're going to do with these doors, other than maybe drill for the pull, is to drill for the hinges. And I'm going to be using this little handheld jig, which is something I've had for years. It works great for me. You could also drill these with a drill press, but the things that you need to remember when you're drilling for these concealed hinges are the depth is important. For instance, if I was going to be putting a really deep route around the edge of these doors, I'd want to make sure I had a test piece that I'd try, because there's nothing that will ruin your day faster than getting a beautiful door and then you drill the hole for the hinge and it comes out the face. So it's always better to test. For instance, we've tested already and set this up for the distance back in from the edge, and that's going to vary somewhat from the different types of hinges. The best thing that I always know to tell people is get you a scrap piece of plywood or a piece of wood or anything, drill a test hole, mount the hinge to it, and then see how it's going to fit. Most of the time we make our doors to overlay about 3/8 of an inch all the way around the opening. And the great thing about the European hinges is they really are adjustable. So all I want to do is drop this on here. Just indexes off the outside edge. Again, thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that you're drilling down from the top far enough to where you don't hit the pocket screws. Which is another good reason to want to put the pocket screws in the top rail of the door. Okay. Let me just grab a couple hinges real quick and we'll mount those. All right, my doors are all hung and adjusted out, and I gotta tell you, I'm really proud to say that I made those doors myself. And the best part is all it took was a miter saw, a router, and my Craig jig. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to like and subscribe.